April 18, 1942. For months after Pearl Harbor, America struck back. 16B. 25 bombers launched from an aircraft carrier deck 650 miles from Japan, a feat never before attempted. Led by Lieutenant Colonel James H. Doolittle, these raiders carried more than bombs. They carried America's defiance, its resolve, and its promise of retribution. This is a story of the mission that shocked an empire and changed the course of World War II. December 7, 1941, a date that would live in infamy. Without warning, without declaration of war, Japanese carrier-based aircraft struck the U.S. naval base at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. In just 2 hours, 2,403 Americans were killed, 1,178 wounded. 8 battleships were sunk or damaged, along with 3 cruisers, 3 destroyers, and nearly 300 aircraft destroyed. It was the deadliest attack on American soil in the nation's history. The next day, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt addressed Congress. His 7-minute speech asked for and received a declaration of war. America was united, outraged, grieving, but determined. In the days that followed, Roosevelt asked one question repeatedly in his daily briefings. When can we strike back at Japan? By early 1942, the war news grew darker by the day. Japan conquered the Philippines, Malaya, Singapore, the Dutch East Indies, Guam, and Wake Island. On April 9, 1942, the battling bastard of Bataan surrendered in the Philippines, the largest capitulation in American military history. In the Atlantic, German U-boats sank American ships within sight of our own coasts. Britain struggled for survival. The German Wehrmacht stood in the suburbs of Moscow. The Axis powers seemed invincible. America needed a victory, not just a military one, but a psychological one. We needed to prove that Japan was not untouchable. The question wasn't if we would strike back, it was how. The answer came from an unexpected observation. Captain Francis S. Lowe was an operations officer on Admiral Ernest J. King's staff. King was Chief of Naval Operations, effectively commander of the entire U.S. Navy. In early January 1942, Captain Lowe flew to Norfolk, Virginia to inspect the readiness of the USS Hornet, America's newest aircraft carrier. As his plane descended toward the naval base, Lowe noticed something unusual below. Twin-engine Army bombers practicing simulated bomb runs on a runway painted with the outline of an aircraft carrier. The sight sparked an audacious idea. What if Army medium bombers could actually take off from a carrier? They couldn't land back on one. That was impossible. But maybe they could launch bomb Japan and fly on to land in China. On January 10, 1942, Captain Lowe walked into Admiral King's office and said, "Sir, I got an idea for bombing Japan." King leaned back in his chair and replied, "Lowe, you might have something there. Work up the details." The task of detailed planning fell to Captain Donald Wu Duncan, the Navy's air operations officer. Given just 5 days, Duncan delivered a handwritten, 30-page operational plan to Admiral King on January 16, 1942. His analysis was thorough. The B-18 bomber was too old. The B-23's wingspan, 92 feet, was too wide to clear a carrier's superstructure. The B-26 Marauder required too much runway for takeoff. But the North American B-25 Mitchell might work. With a 67-foot wingspan, it could clear the carrier's island. With modification for extra fuel, it had the range to reach Japan and continue to China. It wouldn't be easy. Nothing about this mission would be easy, but it was possible. Admiral King approved the plan and immediately took it to Army Air Force's General Henry Hap Arnold. On January 17, 1942, General Arnold met with Captains Lowe and Duncan to review the plan. Arnold, who commanded all Army Air Forces, immediately grasped its strategic value. He divided responsibilities. Captain Duncan would handle Navy planning and logistics. For the Army's role, selecting aircraft, training crews, leading the mission, Arnold chose one man, Lieutenant Colonel James Harold Doolittle. The choice was inspired. Jimmy Doolittle, then 45 years old, wasn't just a pilot. He was an aviation legend. Born in Alameda, California, he'd earned a Ph.D. in aeronautical engineering from MIT. He'd won the Schneider Trophy race for the Army in 1925, setting speed records. He pioneered instrument flying, taking off, navigating, and landing by instruments alone without seeing the ground. In the 1930s, while working for Shell Oil, he pushed for higher-octane aviation fuel, understanding that engine performance would decide future wars. When war came, Doolittle returned to active duty, convinced his expertise would be needed. Now, General Arnold was giving him the mission of a lifetime. Doolittle's response was characteristic. When do we start? The North American B-25 Mitchell was a medium bomber, designed to operate from land bases, not aircraft carriers. With a wingspan of 67 feet and a length of 53 feet, it carried a crew of 5, pilot, co-pilot, bombardier navigator, flight engineer gunner, and radio operator gunner, powered by 2 Wright R-2600 radial engines producing 1,700 horsepower each. It could fly at 270 miles per hour. Standard range was 1,350 miles, carrying a 3,000-pound bomb load. But for this mission, everything would change. Doolittle knew that to reach Japan from a carrier launch point 400 miles offshore, then fly another 1,200 miles to landing fields in China, the B-25s would need modifications. Extra fuel tanks were installed. A 265-gallon steel tank in the bomb bay and a collapsible 160-gallon rubber bladder above it. Lower turret guns were removed to save weight. Additional fuel capacity was added to the aircraft's wings. These modifications extended the range to over 2,400 miles, just barely enough. The bomb load was reduced for 500-pound bombs, 3 high-explosive and 1 incendiary cluster. And in a moment of psychological warfare brilliance, Doolittle added one unusual feature: fake tail guns made from broomsticks painted black to intimidate Japanese pilots attacking from behind. Training began in early March 1942 at Eglin Field in the Florida Panhandle. Doolittle needed volunteer crews, men willing to undertake an extremely hazardous mission without knowing any details. He turned to the 17th Bombardment Group, the most experienced B-25 unit in the Army Air Forces. When the call went out, nearly every man in the group stepped forward. Doolittle selected 24 crews, 16 for the mission, plus 8 spares. None of them knew their target. They knew only that they'd been chosen for something important, something dangerous. The training regimen was brutal. Lieutenant Henry L. Miller from the Navy supervised carrier takeoff procedures. The challenge was unprecedented. A fully loaded B-25 normally required 1,200 feet of runway for takeoff. The USS Hornet's flight deck was only 800 feet long, and much of that would be occupied by other aircraft. Each B-25 would have, at most, 450 feet of deck space. Pilots practiced short-field takeoffs again and again, learning to coax their bombers into the air in impossibly short distances. They practiced low-altitude navigation over water, simulating the approach to Japan. They trained in low-level bombing runs, learning to identify and hit specific targets. They studied aircraft recognition, both friendly and enemy planes. And through it all, they asked no questions. They trusted Jimmy Doolittle. Before committing to the mission, the concept had to be tested. On February 2, 1942, 2 B-25s were loaded aboard the USS Hornet at Norfolk, Virginia. Both were weighted with sandbags to simulate full bomb loads. One was positioned near the bow, where the first raider would launch. The other was placed well aft. The Hornet put to sea just beyond the horizon from shore. At 1:27 p.m., Lieutenant John Fitzgerald received the signal. He advanced the throttles, released the brakes, and roared down the deck. His B-25 lifted off with deck space to spare. 20 minutes later, Lieutenant James McCarthy launched from the aft position, using only 275 feet of deck. The impossible had been proven possible. Army bombers could launch from Navy carriers. The mission was a go. On March 31st and April 1st, 1942, at Naval Air Station Alameda, near San Francisco, 16 modified B-25s were craned aboard the USS Hornet. Each bomber was positioned with extraordinary precision. Wingtips cleared the carrier's superstructure by just 6 feet. The first bomber's nose hung over the bow. The 16th bomber's tail nearly touched the stern. Sailors and Army airmen worked side by side, securing aircraft, loading bombs, and stowing equipment. Civilians watching from the San Francisco waterfront wondered at the sight. Army bombers on a Navy carrier? No official explanation was given. Secrecy was absolute. On April 2nd, the Hornet sailed beneath the Golden Gate Bridge and disappeared into the Pacific. The 80 Doolittle Raiders, 16 crews of 5 men each, still didn't know their destination. That evening, Captain Mark Mitcher, commanding officer of the Hornet, made a ship-wide announcement. This force is bound for Tokyo. The cheering could be heard across the entire task force. The Hornet wouldn't sail alone. On April 13th, 900 miles north of Midway Island, she rendezvoused with Task Force 16 under Vice Admiral William F. Bull Halsey fly his flag aboard the carrier USS Enterprise. The combined force included 2 carriers, 2 heavy cruisers, the Vincennes and Northampton, 1 light cruiser, the Nashville, 8 destroyers, and 2 fleet oilers. It was half of America's Pacific carrier strength, risking everything for one audacious strike. Halsey's orders were clear. Deliver Doolittle's bombers to within 400 miles of Japan, launch them at dawn on April 19th, then retire at maximum speed. If discovered by Japanese forces before reaching the launch point, the operation would be scrubbed, the bombers jettisoned into the sea, and the task force would flee west. Enterprise's fighters and dive bombers would provide air cover. If Japanese ships or aircraft threatened the task force, Halsey would defend it, but maintaining carrier secrecy was paramount. For the next 5 days, Task Force 16 steamed west at 20 knots, driving deeper into enemy-controlled waters. Sailors and airmen alike knew the odds. If Japanese reconnaissance located them, the entire force could be annihilated. The Japanese Navy was faster, more experienced, and controlled these waters. This wasn't a naval engagement. It was a high-stakes gamble. During the voyage, the raiders prepared. They studied maps and photographs of their targets, military installations, factories, oil refineries, and dockyards in Tokyo, Yokohama, Yokosuka, Nagoya, Kobe, and Osaka. Each crew memorized their assigned route and target. They loaded .50 caliber ammunition belts. They armed their bombs for 500-pounder per aircraft, each painted with messages for the Japanese. Some bombs carried the names of crew members killed at Pearl Harbor. Others bore simple messages. From the USA with love. Doolittle gathered his men and explained the stakes. They would bomb Japan in daylight, then fly west of landing fields in China controlled by nationalist forces under Chiang Kai-shek. The plan called for a night landing at airfields near Chuzhou, roughly 1,200 miles beyond Tokyo. Fuel would be critically short. Some planes might not make it. Crew members who survived bailouts or crash landings in China would be assisted by Chinese civilians and military forces, then evacuated to safety. Those who landed in Japanese-occupied territory would be on their own. No one asked to withdraw. These 80 men were going to Tokyo. April 18, 1942. Dawn broke cold and gray over the North Pacific. Heavy swells rocked Task Force 16 as it steamed through choppy seas 650 miles east of Tokyo. The plan called for the bombers to launch the next morning, April 19th, from 400 miles out. But at 7:38 a.m., lookouts on the Enterprise spotted a small vessel on the horizon. It was the Nito Maru No. 23, one of dozens of Japanese picket boats stationed in parallel lines offshore as an early warning network. The little fishing trawler, equipped with radio, had spotted the American fleet. Within minutes, it transmitted an alarm to Tokyo. Enemy carrier sighted. The coded message crackled through Japanese naval headquarters. Admiral Halsey faced an instant decision. The Japanese now knew American carriers were approaching. Within hours, land-based bombers and surface ships would converge on Task Force 16's position. The mission could be scrubbed, dump the B-25s overboard and run. Or they could launch now, 250 miles farther from Japan than planned, giving the bombers barely enough fuel to reach China. Halsey didn't hesitate. At 8 a.m., he ordered the Hornet, launch planes. To Colonel Doolittle and his gallant command, good luck and God bless you. Jimmy Doolittle absorbed the news without visible emotion. The early launch meant his bombers would arrive over Tokyo 5 hours ahead of schedule, in broad daylight, not dawn twilight. It meant they'd burn an extra 250 miles of fuel before even reaching Japan, leaving almost nothing for flight to China. It meant crews would likely have to bail out at night over unknown terrain or crash land on dark beaches. But turning back was not an option. These 80 men had trained for months. America was waiting for this strike. The world was watching to see if the United States would fight back or accept defeat. Doolittle assembled his crews on the Hornet's rain-swept deck, waves crashing over the bow. He explained the situation. Early launch, daylight attack, fuel critical. He gave each man a final chance to withdraw. No one did. They were going to Tokyo. At 8:20 a.m., Jimmy Doolittle climbed into the cockpit of the first B-25, aircraft number 40, to 2,344. Navy personnel positioned his bomber at the very edge of the bow. His nose wheel hung over the deck's end. Behind him, 15 more bombers sat wing to wing. The Hornet turned into the wind. Green water crashed over the bow, drenching Doolittle's aircraft. The deck pitched wildly in heavy swells, rising, falling, rolling. Navy Lieutenant Henry Miller stood to Doolittle's left, holding 2 signal flags. Doolittle would have to time his takeoff perfectly. Throttles to maximum, release brakes as the deck pitched upward, and lift off as the bow rose. Too early, and he'd mush into the sea. Too late, and he'd run out of deck. Miller twirled his flags, signaling, more power, more power. Hold, hold. Then, as the deck began its upward pitch, Miller slashed the flags down. Doolittle released the brakes. The B-25 thundered forward, engine screaming. The deck dropped away beneath him. For an instant, the bomber fell toward the waves. Then the wings grabbed air and Doolittle climbed away. The first bomber was airborne. Behind him, 15 more crews watched and waited their turn. One by one, the bombers launched. Lieutenant Travis Hoover in aircraft number 2, Lieutenant Robert Gray in number 3. Each crew watched the bomber ahead stagger into the air, then positioned their own aircraft for the impossible takeoff. Navy deck handlers pushed each B-25 forward with just inches of clearance. The ships rolled and pitched. Sea spray soaked everything. Navy officers and enlisted men, sailors who'd spent their careers on carriers, had never seen anything like this. Army bombers, each weighing 31,000 pounds fully loaded, lurching down a deck designed for fighters a fraction of their size. Every launch was a controlled crash into the sky. The shortest takeoff run was 275 feet, the longest for 167 feet. By 9:20 a.m., just 1 hour after Doolittle launched, all 16 B-25s were airborne. Not a single accident. Not one man lost. Task Force 16 immediately turned east and ran for home at flank speed. The Enterprise's dive bombers sank the Japanese picket boat that had spotted them. The Nido Maru went down with all hands, ensuring no further reports reached Tokyo. Admiral Halsey's task force would escape without a scratch, having penetrated deeper into Japanese-controlled waters than any American naval force since Pearl Harbor. Now it was up to Doolittle and his 80 men. They set course for Tokyo, flying just 200 feet above the white caps. For 4.5 hours, the 16 bombers flew west in loose formation. They stayed low 100 to 200 feet above the ocean to avoid detection by Japanese radar. Doolittle led the formation until they approached the Japanese coast. Then the crews separated to individual routes and targets. Each crew was alone with their mission. The weather was overcast with intermittent rain, perfect for concealment. As they crossed the Japanese coastline around 12:15 p.m., fishing boats dotted the waters below. Some Japanese fishermen waved at what they assumed were their own aircraft returning from patrol. The bombers roared inland. Crew members saw civilians below, farmers in rice paddies, workers in factories, children in schoolyards. None showed alarm. For months after Pearl Harbor, the Japanese people felt completely safe. Their military leaders had promised that the homeland was invulnerable. Their navy controlled the Pacific. Their army had conquered half of Asia. Air raid shelters sat empty. Anti-aircraft guns were unmanned. Not a single Japanese fighter was airborne over the capital. The The raiders were about to prove how wrong that assumption was. At 12:30 p.m. Tokyo time, Jimmy Doolittle's B-25 roared over capital at 1,500 feet. His targets, a factory district producing war materials, including munitions and aircraft components. His bombardier, Lieutenant Henry Potter, lined up the approach. Below, air raid sirens finally began wailing, but too late. Anti-aircraft guns opened fire, black puffs of flak blossoming in the sky. Japanese Zero fighters scrambled from nearby airfields, but the bombers were already over their targets. Doolittle's bombardier called, "Bombs away." 4 500-pound bombs tumbled from the bay, 3 high-explosive, 1 incendiary cluster. They crashed into factories and warehouses. Fires erupted. Doolittle banked hard left and dove for the deck, racing westward at full throttle. 30 seconds over Tokyo. Mission accomplished. Across Japan, the other 15 crews found their targets. Lieutenant Travis Hoover bombed targets in northern Tokyo. Lieutenant Robert Gray hit steel mills and oil refineries in Tokyo's industrial district. Lieutenant Everett Holstrom struck the Special Naval Landing Force headquarters at Yokosuka Naval Base. Captain David Jones attacked oil tank farms in the Tokyo Bay Area. Captain Edward York bombed factory complexes in northern Tokyo. Lieutenant Ted Lawson, whose book 30 Seconds Over Tokyo would later tell the story, hit industrial targets in southern Tokyo, then turned for China. His would be one of the most harrowing escapes. Lieutenant Dean Hallmark struck port facilities and warehouses in Tokyo. Lieutenant Donald Smith attacked targets in northern Tokyo. Lieutenant Horace Crouch hit industrial areas. Lieutenant William Bauer bombed factory districts. Lieutenant Edgar McElroy struck Yokohama, Japan's second-largest city. Lieutenant Richard Knobloch attacked Yokohama's dockyards. Lieutenant Major Clayton Bissell hit Nagoya, an industrial center 200 miles southwest. Lieutenant William Farrow bombed Nagoya's aircraft factories. Lieutenant Donald Fitzgerald attacked the city of Kobe. And finally, Lieutenant William Jones struck Osaka's industrial complexes. All 16 bombers hit their targets. Material damage was relatively light. About 50 people killed, 400 structures damaged or destroyed, several factories set ablaze. But the psychological impact was shattering. Japan's military leaders had sworn the homeland was invincible. Now American bombers had struck the Imperial Palace District. The emperor himself had been at risk. Japanese civilians, told they were safe, watched their capital burn. The myth of invulnerability was destroyed. The Japanese response was immediate and furious. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander of the combined fleet and architect of Pearl Harbor, was humiliated. For months earlier, he'd promised Japan's military leadership that American carriers would never threaten the homeland. He'd been proven catastrophically wrong. Fighter squadrons scrambled, but found nothing. The bombers were gone. Navy search planes flew hundreds of miles eastward, but discovered no carrier force. Task Force 16 had vanished into the vast Pacific. The raid inflicted minimal physical damage, but the strategic consequences would be enormous. Yamamoto became obsessed with extending Japan's defensive perimeter. He immediately pushed for an operation to seize Midway Island, 1,300 miles northwest of Hawaii. Control of Midway would prevent carrier raids on Japan. It would force the U.S. Pacific Fleet into a decisive battle. It would crush American naval power once and for all. The Japanese Naval General Staff, which had resisted the Midway operation, now agreed. The Doolittle Raid had lit the fuse. 6 weeks later, at the Battle of Midway, the decision would destroy Japan's carrier fleet and turn the tide of the Pacific War. After bombing their targets, the 16 crews turned west, racing for China at maximum speed. They flew low over the East China Sea, burning fuel at emergency rates. The plan called for landing at airfields near Chuzhou in Zhejiang province, where nationalist Chinese forces would shelter them. But 3 catastrophic problems emerged. First, the early launch had cost 250 miles of fuel, enough for an hour of flight. Second, as they approached China after dark, the weather deteriorated. Rain, fog, and turbulence. Third, and most devastating, the Chinese airfields weren't ready. Through a mix-up in communications, The runway lights were never turned on. The homing beacons were silent. 15 crews, running on fumes in the dark, had no way to find the airfields. They faced a terrible choice: crash land in darkness or order the crew to bail out over unknown terrain. One by one, the decisions were made. 11 crews bailed out over China. In darkness, rain, and confusion, 55 men jumped from their bombers, trusting parachutes they'd never tested. Some landed in rice paddies, stunned but alive. Others hit mountainsides or rocky fields, suffering broken bones and injuries. 2 men drowned when they came down in the ocean off the Chinese coast. Corporal Leland Factor bailed out and was never seen again. His fate remains unknown to this day, for crews crash-landed their bombers. Lieutenant Ted Lawson's bomber came down in heavy surf near Japanese-occupied territory. The crash shattered Lawson's leg so badly it would later be amputated. His crew, battered and bleeding, crawled from the wreckage moments before Japanese patrols arrived. One crew, piloted by Captain Edward York, never reached China. Low on fuel and blown north by weather, York made a decision: divert to the Soviet Union. They landed at an airfield near Vladivostok. The Soviets, officially neutral with Japan, interned the crew. They would spend more than a year in comfortable but guarded confinement before escaping across Iran to rejoin American forces. Of the 80 raiders who launched from the Hornet, 3 were killed in action. 8 were captured by Japanese forces. 69 were rescued or escaped. The 69 survivors owed their lives to the Chinese people. In villages across Zhejiang and Jiangxi provinces, Chinese civilians risked everything to shelter the Americans. Farmers hid them from Japanese patrols. Doctors treated their injuries with meager supplies. Guides led them through enemy-occupied territory on foot, journeys of hundreds of miles through mountains and forests. Some Chinese rescuers spoke no English. The Americans spoke no Chinese. But the message was clear: you are friends, you are safe, we will protect you. Father Wendelin Dunker, a Catholic missionary, sheltered several crews at his mission. Lieutenant Harold Watson and his crew were hidden by Chinese guerrillas for weeks, while Japanese forces searched the area. Local resistance fighters created a network of safe houses, passing airmen from village to village like an underground railroad. Jimmy Doolittle himself, after bailing out and landing in a rice paddy, was found by Chinese farmers who fed him, treated his injuries, and guided him to nationalist forces. Within weeks, most of the surviving raiders reached safety. They were evacuated through India and returned to the United States as heroes. But 8 men were not so fortunate. The crew of aircraft number 6, Dean Hallmark, Robert Meter, Chase Nielsen, William Dieter, and Donald Fitzmaurice, was captured near Japanese-occupied Nanchang. The crew of aircraft 16, William Farrow, Robert Height, George Barr, Jacob DeShazer, and Harold Spatz, was captured near Japanese lines in coastal China. For these 8 men, the nightmare was just beginning. They were transported to Tokyo, imprisoned, interrogated, tortured. Japanese military police beat them with fists, clubs, and bamboo rods. They were denied adequate food, slowly starving on bowls of rice. They endured water torture, being stripped naked and doused with frigid water in winter. Interrogators demanded military information. Where were the carriers? How many planes? What were the next targets? The prisoners revealed nothing. In August 1942, a Japanese military tribunal convened a show trial. The 8 raiders were accused of bombing civilian targets and killing non-combatants. In reality, they'd bombed military and industrial facilities. But the outcome was predetermined. All 8 were sentenced to death. Then, in a calculated act of propaganda, the Japanese announced that the emperor, in his infinite mercy, had commuted 5 sentences to life imprisonment. 3 would be executed. On October 15, 1942, Lieutenant Dean Hallmark, Lieutenant William Farrow, and Sergeant Harold Spatz were taken from their cells. They were given a last meal, rice and a few vegetables. They were allowed to write final letters to their families. Then they were led to an execution ground outside Shanghai. Blindfolded and kneeling, they faced a firing squad. Each man died with honor. Their bodies were cremated and the ashes scattered. Their families wouldn't learn their fate for 3 years. The 5 survivors, Robert Meter, Chase Nielsen, Robert Height, Jacob DeShazer, and George Barr, remained imprisoned. They endured 40 months of hell, starvation, disease, torture, and solitary confinement. Lieutenant Robert Meter died in captivity in December 1943 from malnutrition and dysentery. His body weighed less than 80 pounds. The remaining 4 survived until August 1945, when American forces liberated them after Japan's surrender. Chase Nielsen weighed 90 pounds. George Barr weighed 85 pounds. They could barely walk, but they had endured. Jacob DeShazer, who had endured the worst tortures, later returned to Japan as a Christian missionary, spending 30 years helping the very people who had imprisoned him. His story of forgiveness would inspire Mitsuo Fukuda, the Japanese pilot who led the attack on Pearl Harbor, to convert to Christianity. The Chinese people who rescued the raiders paid a terrible price. Enraged by the raid and humiliated by their inability to capture most of the crews, Japanese military forces launched a campaign of retribution. In May 1942, the Japanese Imperial Army launched the Zhujiang-Jiangxi Campaign, a scorched-earth offensive across eastern China. Any village suspected of helping Americans was destroyed. The Japanese army systematically massacred civilians. Schools, hospitals, and churches were burned. Chinese soldiers and civilians were tortured and executed. Biological warfare units, including the infamous Unit 731, spread cholera, typhoid, and bubonic plague through the region to kill Chinese civilians. The death toll was staggering. Historians estimate that 250,000 Chinese civilians were killed in retaliation for helping the Doolittle Raiders. Entire villages were wiped out. Families who had sheltered one American airman for a single night were executed. Men, women, children. Father Wendelin Dunker, the missionary who had several crews, was arrested, interrogated, and beaten. He survived, but many of his Chinese parishioners did not. This was the price of China's courage. American airmen had risked their lives to strike Japan. Chinese civilians gave their lives to save those airmen. It is a debt that can never be repaid, only remembered. When news of the raid reached America, the nation erupted in celebration. For 4 months, Americans had absorbed only defeats. Pearl Harbor, Wake Island, Bataan. Now, finally, victory. Radio broadcasts interrupted programming with special bulletins. Newspaper headlines screamed, "Tokyo bombed. Doolittle Raid shocks Japan." President Roosevelt, asked at a press conference where the bombers had launched from, smiled and said, "Shangri-La, the fictional Himalayan paradise." The secret would remain classified for more than a year. Jimmy Doolittle, convinced the raid had been a failure because he'd lost all 16 aircraft, expected to face a court-martial. Instead, he was promoted 2 grades to brigadier general and awarded the Medal of Honor. Every raider received the Distinguished Flying Cross. Those killed or captured received Purple Hearts. The material damage in Japan was minimal, about $100,000 worth of destruction. But the strategic and psychological impact was immense. American morale soared. Allied leaders, seeing that the United States would fight, renewed their commitments. Japanese military leaders, shamed by the raid, made fatal strategic errors. The push toward Midway led to the destruction of 4 Japanese carriers in June 1942, the turning point of the Pacific War. Fighter squadrons and anti-aircraft units were recalled from the front lines to defend the home islands, weakening Japanese offensives. The invincible empire had been proven vulnerable. The Doolittle Raiders remained bonded for life. In 1959, the city of Tucson, Arizona presented the Raiders with a set of sterling silver goblets, one engraved with each man's name. The goblets were stored in a special case at the U.S. Air Force Academy. Each year, on April 18th, surviving Raiders would gather for a toast. When a Raider died, his goblet was turned upside down. As the years passed, more goblets turned over. The last public reunion was held in 2013, when only 4 Raiders remained. Lieutenant Colonel Richard Cole, Jimmy Doolittle's co-pilot on the first bomber, was the last survivor. He died on April 9, 2019, at age 103. The final bottle of cognac, from 1896, the year Doolittle was born, remained sealed. It will be open when the last raider passes. For a final toast from beyond, the goblets now rest at the National Museum of the U.S. Air Force in Dayton, Ohio. Most are turned upside down, but the legacy stands upright. The Doolittle Raid changed the course of World War II. It didn't destroy Japan's industrial capacity or military strength, but it shattered Japan's strategic calculus. The rush to extend the defensive perimeter led to overreach. The obsession with destroying American carriers led to Midway, where Japan lost 4 carriers, hundreds of aircraft, and its best pilots. The war in the Pacific, which might have lasted years longer, accelerated toward its conclusion. By 1945, hundreds of B-29 superfortresses were firebombing Japanese cities from bases in the Marianas, bases captured in campaigns made possible by the Midway victory that the Doolittle Raid had provoked. The atomic bombs that ended the war were delivered by B-29s. Descendants of the concept Doolittle had proven American bombers could reach Japan. 16 bombers didn't win the war, but they proved that America would never surrender, never accept defeat, and would strike back no matter the cost. 80 men volunteered for a mission they knew was nearly suicidal. 16 bombers launched from a carrier deck in a feat never before attempted. They flew 650 miles to strike the heart of an empire. They proved that America's enemies were not invincible. They lifted the spirits of a nation reeling from defeat. 3 died in action. 8 were captured. 3 executed. 1 died in captivity. 1 remains missing. 69 made it home. And 250,000 Chinese civilians gave their lives to save them. The Doolittle Raid, 16 bombers that shocked Japan, changed the course of a war and proved that courage, audacity, and sacrifice can alter history. We will never forget.